Thank you, Roger, and I appreciate that introduction. And you should bear in mind also, it's not just the challenge that in Oklahoma we measure our soil in inches, but in Oklahoma I have never is a pretty bold statement, but I cannot remember ever having anyone pray for dry weather to plant or harvest. Now, I know that occurs in other places. And Roger alluded to my heritage in Oklahoma. You also have to understand my family, my genetic roots, and my parents were always very focused on genealogy. My mother's family were East Texas cotton farmers before they came to western Oklahoma, and Georgia cotton farmers before that. But on the other side of the house, my grandfather Lucas was born in Peru, Indiana, and his father, my great-great-grandfather, or great-great-grandfather, was born in Wabash, Indiana also. So there's a little mixed cultural heritage there, and I appreciate all the challenges that does bring about. Roger mentioned the nature of the Ag Committee and what brought us to this point, and you all are well aware of that, but for just a moment, before we get into the meat of the topic about where we are, let's think about that just for a second, if you would. At the beginning of this session of Congress, the privilege of becoming, the responsibility of becoming chairman of the House Agriculture Committee, 46 good, brave souls, 20 Democrats, 26 Republicans. It's still worth noting that 16 of my 26 Republicans were brand new freshmen. Never been on the committee, never been in Congress, never been a part of the Farm Bill. And even on the other side of the room, where at the beginning of this session of Congress, freshman Democrats were rather hard to come by. Oh, shucks. Literally, 7 of those Democrats, well, not freshmen, had never served on the committee before, had never been a part of the Farm Bill process at committee level before. So literally, half the committee were brand new to the process and the culture of the House Agriculture Committee, which those of you who cover it with intensity, and that's most of you in this room, know it's a different culture than other committees. And from my perspective, I say thank goodness, by the way, a different culture. But we put a lot of effort in the first year and a half in getting ready to do the Farm Bill process. And I would acknowledge this to you. I'm very proud and pleased with the product that passed last July, with a majority of both the Democrats and Republicans voting for the legislation. Now, that said, let's talk about the things that are at hand, the things that matter to you right now, the 20-ton gorilla in the room, the elephant, however you want to describe it. Let's talk about the Farm Bill process. And maybe before we launch into that, there are a couple things we should think about for just a moment that really determine what will happen in the Farm Bill process. First and foremost, will the powers that be, as my late father would have said, agree on a plan to avoid the fiscal cliff? And right along with that, and we'll discuss those in this order, will my ag community friends, will my fellow Aggies be able to get on the same page if we're asked to come together in a way to achieve a set amount of savings should the powers that be agree this fall into this early winter? I think it goes without saying that I, like most of my colleagues in Congress, hope that some kind of a grand understanding, an agreement is reached. And the threshold question, of course, is what happens to taxes, what kind of revenue sources are added to the federal budget equation, and what kind of changes are made in the major entitlement programs. If the powers that be, and I think you have to reference probably a couple of individuals in that regard, the President of the United States, Speaker of the United States House, can achieve that, what kind of a reconciliation process will we go through? Because let's face it, we have 3 weeks left before approximately 3 weeks left before December 31. And to make dramatic changes in the tax code, dramatic changes in entitlements, dramatic changes in the sequestration that's on the books, is a rather daunting challenge. And even if they agree to the principles there, that would require in some form or fashion for us in the Ag Committee to step up to the plate with our savings. Now, it can be done. And if the powers that be determine that it will be done, it will happen. I've been a House member all my life, and that's defining my life in this town. And even before that, in the state legislature, I was a member of the State House of Representatives. It's a different body than the other deliberative body. But I would say even of the United States Senate, when they decide to move, we've all watched things go at light speed through that body by unanimous consent, by voice vote, when the parameters are put together. Now, that said, the amount of dollars that are determined to be impacted by revenue or sequestration of the entitlement changes determine what kind of savings that we'll have to achieve in the Farm Bill. I would expect, if there is a grand understanding, that each of the standing committees, not just agriculture, but each of the standing committees will have an obligation to make certain things happen. And if you look at the custom of budget reconciliation, where in the past we've passed legislation that spelled out targets, that set dates, that required definitive actions, and set up a mechanism for those actions to take place if it wasn't done in the orderly fashion, i.e. thinking of things like the Budget Committee coming in and making adjustments for various committees, it can be done. Now, whatever that number is, assuming there is such a grand understanding, we will have to, all of the standing committees will have to meet that obligation. And agriculture is no exception. We just happen to be in the process of the every 5-year Farm Bill rewrite. Now, that said, let's talk about the Farm Bill process for just a moment. I understand that the concept of a revenue program is very important to certain regions of the country. It's very important to my friends in the other body. I respect that. I acknowledge that. And that's why in the House committee passed version of the Farm Bill, we have revenue language. Perhaps not quite the language that the Senate passed in committee or across the floor, but nonetheless we have revenue language. But in the House we also have this concept called choice, deciding which way you go, deciding what's best for your farm, your region, your commodity, giving you a choice to make decisions. And I like to refer to that as price loss coverage. There are different phrases that float around these days, depending on what your perspective is about how the commodity title should read. But you see, I believe, as sincere as some of my friends are, that if you depend exclusively on the revenue program, which is great when times are good, which will be pretty good if times start down, but after a certain point you'll literally fall off a different cliff, not a physical cliff, you'll fall off a different cliff, that we need to give our producers a choice, and that's what the price loss coverage is all about. And even in the best of times, revenues that's now envisioned in both the House and Senate bill will not work for everybody everywhere in this country. Now, I have faith that my fellow farmers out there and ranchers, when given an opportunity to have choice, given a chance to make up their own minds, because they are, without question, the best practical agricultural economist in the world. What you can do with a calculator and a pencil is pretty amazing at the local coffee shop, and I've watched it. They'll make the right decisions. And I would also note, you say, well, Frank, if one size fits all sort of a shoe doesn't work, you can always go back and fix it later. Think about what my colleague and good friend Mr. Peterson has said on various occasions, both publicly and privately. And that is, whatever is determined here, however we fit into the new physical world, there's not going to be a second chance. If we don't get it right, we'll not have the resources in the foreseeable future. We'll not have an opportunity or a vehicle to correct it. We have to get it right. And that's so very important to me. Bottom line, I suppose, is if the White House and congressional leaders agree on how to avoid the fiscal cliff and call upon us in the agricultural community, the House and Senate Ag Committees, to pony up savings as a part of our 5-year Farm Bill, we need to be ready, and there's no reason we can't be ready, because the good work that would be done to be prepared for the next 3 weeks, in the worst case scenario, is still the same good work that will need to be done in week 4 or the day after that. Now, there are a variety of scenarios, and I know there's some of my friends in the commodity groups and some of my colleagues, both in the House and the Senate, who are very fired up about this concept of no extension. Do it all now. Well, I would like to have all my Christmas presents on Christmas morning too. But the magnitude of the changes that we're talking about, doing away with the core safety net of the last 15 years, the direct payment program, shifting to what I believe ultimately will be a revenue program with an option for a price loss program, is no simple legislative achievement. It'll be no simple process for USDA to turn that law into rules and regulations to make it implementable. It'll be no simple process to do the software and to train the FSA people and to educate the folks out there. So I simply offer this thought to you. If I get my way, it's the same spirit as all my colleagues. We'll do it completely. We'll do it soon. But you may have to have a transition period to make things work. I don't want to get caught in a scenario where, with the expiring of the, quote, old safety net in September of this year, that we don't have another safety net until September of 2013. I don't want that scenario to happen. Now, there's lots of challenges that lie ahead of us, even with the commodity title sorted out, and I think we've made great progress in recent days, and I understand you may hear from some of my good friends. There's still some other issues like the nutrition title, 80% of the Farm Bill spending, an area of tremendously controversial on the floor of the United States House, I suspect. Just bear in mind, reform and the savings and the stewardship of taxpayers' dollars that is a part of that process has to occur in all areas of the Farm Bill. And I think ultimately that's where I will have to sign off. And the things that we've done in the House, the processes we've gone through, our earlier effort at budget reconciliation, our efforts in a committee markup of a Farm Bill, I think demonstrate quite clearly that you can make real reforms in the nutrition title and not, and this is very important to me, not take 1 calorie off one deserving person's plate. They just may have to apply. They may have to demonstrate their income and their asset levels. And a lot of these people who are getting automatic benefits for a variety of reasons will be eligible under the regular process. But I think it's a much more defendable, sustainable way to address the issue as we work our way through the rest of this process. That said, I know there's controversy about price loss coverage among some of my friends, but I would ask you to bear this in mind. I assume a few of you have seen Mr. Burns' latest documentary on the Dust Bowl. I live in what the folks in the Panhandle of Oklahoma call downstate Oklahoma. Yes, if you're in the Panhandle, the other 74 counties are downstaters. It took me a long time to understand that that was just a statement of geography, not some sort of rude comment about the rest of us. I respect that. But the Dust Bowl, and Ken kind of focuses on the Panhandle and Southwest Kansas and North Texas. That horrendous process was a huge slice of the Southern Plains. And it was the weather, and it was the Great Depression, the impact that it had on people. Now, I will confess the second part is still on my DVR, but after watching the first part, I thought I was 12 years old again, sitting at the dinner table with my grandparents, listening to my parents and grandparents. My father was born in 31. My mother was born in 32. They started school in 1937. And if you remember the Great Depression, we slammed to the bottom in 33, and we crawled out a little bit. And economically as a country, we slammed back down in 37. And then the Second World War started, and we pulled out, and the weather patterns changed. But I was raised on discussions about how people who lived in decent enough houses stuffed paper and stuffed things around the cracks to keep the dirt out. But not everybody in my home county, according to my parents and grandparents, lived in houses that were good enough to do that. And much as Mr. Burns talks about in his documentary, you had your pan of water and your towel, and you put it over your face if you couldn't keep the dirt out of the house. And you had a second towel, and you rotated it back and forth because it would cover over. I guess what I'm saying is, when the Depression started, I had 14,000 neighbors in my home county. By the time the last census was taken, we had made it back in my home county to approximately 3,800 people. Wham! My goal, as a fellow who was raised by grandparents who were young men and women with kids, who were scarred forever by the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl, raised by parents who then went through a 4-year drought in the 1950s, which statistically was worse than the 30s, save but better technology, and all of the efforts we'd spent on the soil conservation programs in this country. A fellow who came home from college in 1982, just in time to watch the collapse of both ag and energy properties, the price, the industries at home. Just bear in mind, my goal in this, and no matter what some of my colleagues in this town may say, we don't control the weather, but we do decide the policies. The thing that made the 30s even more horrendous than the weather was the failure of policy. In the 1950s, we survived the weather with the help of better policies. In the 1980s, the weather was okay, but the policies damn near destroyed my part of the country. I guess what I'm saying is, I can't control the weather, but when my tenure, and we have term limits for chairman in the House Republican Conference, when my tenure as chairman of the House Ag Committee comes to an end, and I go back to the land of the Okies to be a very happy Okie again, I want to be able to walk up and down the street and know that in my part of being a chairman, in my tenure in this body, we didn't do the things that would create another 1930s or another 1980s. That's my goal. So it's personal, it's important, it's all of those discussions, lectures at the table from the time I can barely remember. It matters to me personally. And with that, Roger, let's see if our good friends have a better recollection of the 30s.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. We do have a mobile microphone that we will gladly bring around. We ask that when you do ask a question, please state your name and your affiliation, company-wise or party-wise, if you like. And that way then we can accurately get a read on who's asking the questions, as this forum is covered for a lot of people. So are there questions for Chairman Lucas?
That's a good sign.
Well, you didn't quite escape, sir.
Hi, good morning. My name's James Niger, and I'm with the Farm Credit Association in Omaha, Nebraska. You had mentioned something to the effect, if you depend exclusively on a revenue program, you'll eventually fall over a cliff. So I'm curious what that means. I didn't understand.
Revenues based on the assumption. Remember, my degree is agricultural economics, and I've spent a lot of time with those real practicing ag economists in the coffee shops back home and around the country. Revenues based on the assumption that you're going to use the last 5 years of cash prices, and if you have a deviation in the Senate passed version of the bill, an 11% adjustment, you trigger a payment. House passed version, committee passed version, I should say, of the bill, if you have a 15% deviation in price, you trigger a payment. That's all based on the assumptions of the level of price. If you have a commodity that has had record high prices, then you operate off a wonderful plateau. There's only a couple of commodities can I think of that have set the plateau. Now, some would argue, and my friends on the committee might not all necessarily agree with me, but some would argue as long as you have something like the Renewable Fuel Standard, where 45% of the crop is going through a government-mandated program, instead of the traditional uses, that's bumped up the price. Well, with the price bumped up, you're at a level that's wonderful. But if you enter a period when you have good weather, and it can rain when it's supposed to sometimes, Roger, even in Oklahoma, if you enter a period where the world economy would really slow down in the developing areas, i.e. supply increase, demand weaken, then suddenly you might see cash prices begin to come down. Well, for the first 1, 2, maybe 3 years, you benefit greatly. But remember, the 5-year average keeps readjusting. And there comes a point when it has no effect. That's why certain producers, in addition to protecting the revenue stream, would like to have the option of being able to set some bottom price on the floor, so that when it collapses so low, you don't go all the way to the basement, so to speak. But a choice. And in the House-passed version, you pick. Beginning of the 5-year Farm Bill, whichever way you want to go with it, but you pick, and you're locked in then for 5. Revenue takes the best of times and keeps them the best. But when the hangover comes, it'll be vicious. And in the worst case scenario, I suspect anyone who signed up for 5 years of revenue will come screaming back to Congress and ask that the law be changed and they be allowed to flip the price. But Colin quite correctly said, the bill we pass is the bill we have for 5 years.
I have a question right up here.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman. Dave Lyons, Louis Dreyfus.
There you go, Dave.
Yeah, Dave Lyons, Louis Dreyfus. You're thinking about some kind of a reconciliation type process, it sounds like. You're talking about an extension really for 2013, and then it takes effect, and whatever the savings are and the changes that you have to make take effect in 2014, or you're not quite that sure about...
Well,
I'm not
first of
trying to
all,
get you
nothing-
to say something...
Nothing is certain. And when I make my comments, and I made some comments back in Oklahoma that caught some attention, this is my own personal speculation. You've been here 18 and a half years. You've watched the sausage be ground in several different ways, shoved in several different type tubes, but it's still sausage grinding. We cannot address all of the problems that need to be addressed in a grand agreement in 3 weeks' time. Budget reconciliation, and maybe for some of our folks who've not been through it, you've observed this horrible process. In budget reconciliation, everybody agrees not only to definitive spending, and in the traditional phrase budget reconciliation, that means cuts. In this phrase, it could be, in this use of the concept, it could be to agree to hard numbers on spending by committee. It could have hard instructions on reforms. Think about the social welfare entitlement changes that are necessary. It would have to have not only specific numbers spelled out, but there'd have to be a hard date by which committees would implement such language. And there'd have to be a mechanism, as in budget reconciliation, where if the authorizing committees couldn't do their work, somebody would step in. I would tell you, as what all of you are well aware of, there's not an authorizing committee chairman alive who wouldn't lay down and die first before he would allow the budget committee to do his work or her work. But that's the enforcement kind of a mechanism that you would use to trigger a date certain in the future to accomplish it. Why do I use the phrase transition? Well, in policies as complicated as ag, with the kind of changes that are coming that are so dramatic, I think you need time for the poor souls down at USDA to get their work done. I actually like the USDA folks. I don't want to torture them for the joy of it. And some mechanism by which whatever is agreed to, or shall I say, agreed to by the senior management, so to speak, that's imposed upon the committees, that's accepted by both bodies, because you have to have a law passed to implement these things. And traditionally, remember, in budget reconciliation, you have expedited procedures for final consideration. And that doesn't mean much in the House, but remember what budget reconciliation means in the Senate. It's a conference committee report, it's a limited debate, it's greatly expedited over there in that body. But some kind of a mechanism like that to achieve the ultimate point. But the first challenge, of course, is you have to have some people in positions of authority make the kind of decisions that are required that then can be impressed upon both bodies. There's only a couple people that can do that right now. And depending on which day's report you read, there are discussions or there are not. I'd also throw you one wild card in here, and I've said this before publicly, and you all are very, very well aware of it. You've got a couple of real extra challenges. My Republican friends don't want to raise taxes on anybody for any reason. Just a fundamental principle. The view within many of my colleagues in the House is it's not we don't take in enough revenue, it's we just write too many hot checks, to use the Western Oklahoma vernacular. But then I also serve with some liberal friends, and I like the people I serve with. They're all my friends, who probably view this as Christmas Day 6 days late. If you believe that more of the American economy should flow through the federal government to be managed, distributed as the federal government sees fit, i.e. higher taxes, then raising everybody's taxes is wonderful if you're a true liberal. And by the same token, since much of the social welfare spending is off the table in sequestration, you cut defense and you cut a lot of the infrastructure related items. Now there's some pain everywhere, don't get me wrong, but you look at that and you say, aha, we can finally complete the reshaping of government that began 2 years ago. So why would you want to be a part of slowing down this great juggernaut? So there's some real tough issues to sort out here. At what point? The markets seem to think, financial markets at least, seem to think, by what I read and watch, seem to think something's going to be worked out. At what point do they respond if it's not worked out? In my own district in Oklahoma, the number of land sales and big asset sales is increasing. I mean, every old farmer and rancher, he or she, either one, understands that this capital gains rate isn't going to survive no matter what. And they're making the decisions. That starts the movement. It takes weeks, months to plan to sell agricultural assets. But on the 28th of December, it doesn't take long to call your broker, stock or bond. So at some point, the markets will help encourage this process. That's why I keep a bottle of Maalox around.
I think we've got time for about one more question for the chairman.
Yeah, Chairman Jim Wiesmar.
And by the way, thank you for the invitation to come today.
You know, with your passion that you expressed, the 30s and the 80s, I'll just put words in your mouth and see if you agree. Will you put a line in the sand that you'll insist on PLC as far as the option? And if that's the case, the big difference between the two bills, as you well know, is in the operation of the revenue on what acres they're paid for. Yours, if I recall, is based on base acres, and there's another structure, which a lot of difference in money there.
Let me simply respond this way. If the Farm Bill that ultimately becomes law, sooner as opposed to later, would be my hope, is not something that every region and every commodity can